The Atheist Debates Patreon project presents a debate review of Matt Dillahunty versus Ben Fischer on Is There Good Evidence for the Existence of God? So in the past week, I've done a debate with Ben Fischer, who I didn't know before. I don't know much at all about. I'm going to talk a little bit about him just because that's relevant to the interactions here, and nothing that I say here is intended to be disparaging of him. He seemed like a really nice guy and everything, but we need to go through what happened in the debate. And while the introduction description of this may be a lengthy one, I don't know that the video really will be because of what happened during the debate. So this was done on modern day debates, like most of the other debates that I've been doing, especially during the quarantine. And I had never heard of Ben and didn't know anything about him. We met literally 10, 15 minutes or so before the debate began and had a quick back and forth discussion. He asked about me and my background with Christianity, and I asked about him, and he talked about, periods of time where he had doubted his faith, and now he's working, and recovered it and is engaged in ministry on behalf of it. When I'm asked to do a debate, I try to make sure that we define the topic of the debate and the rules of the debate in such a way that we can hopefully have a good discussion. Because if the debate title was, is there evidence for the existence of God? Well, I'm not going to debate that. Because while atheists in general will say colloquially, there is no evidence for God, what they tend to mean by that is there is no convincing evidence for God. There is no good evidence for God. There is no compelling evidence for God. Because, yes, testimony is evidence. It's just evidence of pretty much no value. Like, you could stack up testimony from 1 million people, and if there are no substantive facts to go with it, you haven't accumulated more evidence. You've just said, here's 100 people who are convinced of this, but why are they convinced? And if it's all because they saw it with their own eyes, that's a different category than 1 million people being convinced because they read a book or they heard a story and this convinced them. So it's what evidence, testimonial evidence, by the way, is based on other evidence. If I say to you, I am convinced that I am recording this. Well, the reason that I'm convinced that I'm recording this is because I can look at the camera, I can see the screen, I can see the meter moving along with my voice, so I know that voice is being recorded, or I know that at least the camera is telling me that the voice is being recorded. I can see the red light showing that it's recording. I can see the timer going. There's a bunch of evidence, and it's a testable proposition, because if I get to the end of this video and pull it in and try to upload it on the computer and there's nothing there, then clearly my being convinced that I'm recording this was in error. But if I say to you, I'm convinced I'm recording right now, should that be enough evidence for you? Well, maybe. It depends on what other evidence you're using to judge it from. For example, if you know me to be reasonable, if you know me to be honest, if you know that I have recorded many videos and have some level of expertise in determining whether or not I'm actually recording, all of those things factor in to whether or not you have a justification. There's a video I did recently kind of challenging the notion that extraordinary claims require extraordinary evidence. Because in truth, all claims require sufficient evidence. And the reason we call claims extraordinary is because they seem to exist outside the realm of what we would consider normal and supported by evidence. If I say I'm recording, well, you already know. There are cameras that can record things. You've watched videos before. You have mountains of evidence that recording a video is utterly mundane. And so when I say I'm recording a video, you may not want any more evidence. Now, if it's me recording you for something important, you may want more evidence than just, well, Matt knows what he's doing and thinks he's got it right. You may want to see the indications on the camera yourself, that little flashing red light. So it would be a mistake to debate, is there evidence for the existence of God? Because you have to walk in and say, yep, there's evidence, there's anecdotal evidence, and you can stack up all of it you want, but it's not ever going to be enough to establish that a God exists. And that's why I try, when I'm doing debates, to say, is there sufficient evidence for the existence of God, or is there good evidence for the existence of God? And so that's what I did with this one, and I came in prepared to have that discussion. Unfortunately, and I'm not going to try to figure out why this happened, Ben was not interested in that same discussion. I think he thought he was, And the way he argued, which I'll get to in just a minute, seemed to suggest that he genuinely thought he was presenting good evidence. But it doesn't seem that he has a good understanding of what counts as evidence, what would count as good evidence, or the difference between evidence for a proposition and an axiomatic assumption. So we'll talk a little bit about that. There's a famous story, which may or may not be true, about Laplace. And when Laplace was being asked about his scientific models, where God was. And Laplace famously replied, although he probably didn't, that he had no need of that hypothesis. That he was, essentially the position there is that I was able to do the science and create this model without needing a God as a variable, as an assumption. There are many assumptions that we need to make. We have to assume that we're living in a reality, that we're perhaps in a shared reality, that logic is reasonable and inviolate, and that our senses are generally reliable. Those are things that we can't necessarily demonstrate, but we do need to assume in order to be able to have conversations about any of these subjects. And so if you begin with those assumptions, why on earth couldn't you just assume everything else? Like, I don't need to demonstrate anything. I can just assume that, the light's going to come on when I flick the switch. I can assume that electricity, works and it works this way. The reason that you don't just get to assume, or the reason you should minimize assumptions, is that because assumptions are risky. If you assume that the world works one way and you don't have good evidence for it, then what is the risk that you're willing to accept? I'm assuming that if I step off of this building, gravity won't pull me down to the ground and accelerate me at roughly 9.8 meters per second squared. I can assume that, but if I'm wrong, it has consequences. And so that's where you get to something like Occam's razor, which William of Ockham famously put forward this notion. It is often simplified to our best guess is probably best, or we're probably right in assuming how it works. It's often characterized in that way as if inference is reliable. That's not what Occam's razor is. Occam's razor more strictly says that you should not multiply entities unnecessarily. And what that means when you get down to it is you shouldn't make more assumptions than are necessary, you should make the bare minimum of assumptions. You should have a system that includes the minimal assumptions, postulates, axioms, etc. And so what Ben did was show up and basically present in his opening. He had 15 minutes for an opening on whether or not there's good evidence for the existence of God. And I think about the first 13, if I'm correct, had nothing, well, actually, nothing in his opening had anything to do with evidence for God or good evidence for God. In fact, the first 13 minutes was a dissertation on old philosophical notions about foundationalism, coherentism, and infinitism, which is all a meta-level analysis of how we should evaluate evidence or what should count as evidence. But he presented what he called his axiomatic argument for the existence of God. And here's the problem. And I'll say this many times. I don't bear Ben any ill will. I'm not beating up on Ben. I'm not, He doesn't have an argument. I don't understand how someone defending theism, on behalf of theism, can put themselves forward as a serious debater of the subject, claim that they have their own novel, axiomatic argument for the existence of God, and then not be able to express that argument in syllogistic form at all. And what's interesting is during the debate, I asked Ben if he could do this, can he present this as a syllogism? And my memory of this, I could be wrong, was that he suggested that he could, or flatly said yes, or at least gave me the impression that he was going to, and then never did. If you have an argument for the existence of God, and it's still in its fledgling state because you're sitting at home and you're bouncing it around, maybe go and find some theologians and apologists and some counter-apologists and some representatives of views that don't express and say, look, here's my argument. I've written it down. Please review this and let me know where I've made a mistake. If you haven't done that, the arrogance of thinking that you have an argument is a little staggering. But if you think that you have an argument and you can't put it in syllogistic form, you're not there yet. I have countless arguments against the existence of God, and I'll put them in air quotes because that doesn't mean that I have written them all down as a syllogism, and it certainly doesn't mean that I can present them all in syllogistic form off the top of my head. But if I were asked to do a debate on what are the best arguments against the existence of God, I would have a syllogistic structure. In particular, I would have some syllogistic form of the argument from divine hiddenness, probably several arguments of that type from either other people who, are fans of this notion of divine hiddenness, or from my own. But Ben didn't do that. Instead, what he said was that God was axiomatic. And in his understanding, axiom simply means true. It means self-evidently true. And so when he shows up to say, yes, there's good evidence for the existence of God, his evidence is that it is axiomatically true that God exists. The problem, as I brought up in the debate, there's a number of problems. One is that that's not really what axiom means. An axiom is something that we assume to be true because we cannot demonstrate. If you can demonstrate something is true, you don't ever need to assume it. If you can provide sound evidence in argument that something is true, you don't ever need to assume it. And by the way, for many of the axioms that we assume, the only assumption is that they apply universally. We can show that identity, non-contradiction, and excluded middle, the foundations of logic that we have to presuppose or that we might consider as axioms, we can demonstrate that they are true. We just can't demonstrate that they are universally true everywhere under all circumstances. We assume that that's the case because you would have to assume that they're true to try to disprove them. You would wind up with a circular argument. However, if they're not true, then there's no problem with a circular argument, or at a minimum, a circular argument isn't necessarily a problem. So it's not that when we assume the logical absolutes, we're just guessing and running with our gut instinct. It's we're going to assume this is true and we're going to put it to the test. And what ends up being the only assumption about logic is not whether or not it's true, but whether or not it applies everywhere, all the time, forever. Whether or not it is inviolate and absolute. And I don't know how you demonstrate that. But those axioms are worthwhile. Similarly, I don't have a solution to the problem of hard solipsism. I trust that I live in a reality with other people. I can't prove it, but it continues to appear to be the case. And if I were to assume that I don't share a reality with other people, now all of a sudden that results in problems. Have I put it to the test in the death thing? Have I walked into a traffic to make sure that the bus that's coming towards me is real or isn't real? No, but I've done it with things like a hot stove and other things like that, where somebody says, this is the case, and if I'm doubtful, I can test it and put it to the test. An axiom is not something that is just self-evidently true. I think what Ben may have been talking about were ideas that some philosophers consider properly basic. And I have a big problem with the notion that there are properly basic beliefs. Now, it may be the case that there's some definition of properly basic that I'm okay with that applies to things like, my senses. Because people want to say that my senses are properly basic. I don't think that's the case. This isn't really the video to get into a lengthy philosophical thing. I'd actually love to get Ben or somebody else on, maybe Dr. Resnick or somebody else, who may think that there are properly basic beliefs, and I disagree, and then we can have a discussion about that. And it has nothing to do with whether or not there's a God. His view was it is axiomatic, self-evident, that God is real, and that because it's axiomatic, it is therefore true, which means that it must be good evidence. And I don't know how to express this in any way other than I did during the debate, which is that's not true. I mean, literally I went, and I granted there's going to be people who are going to say, Matt went to Wikipedia. Yes. First of all, Wikipedia is an incredibly good source, provided that you also research the links that people are pointing to show what things are about. It's publicly editable, but it's generally reliable. Wikipedia may in fact be the most reliable broad source in the world. That doesn't mean we should just take it at its at face value, because I could go in and edit this Wikipedia page to say something that it doesn't. The nice thing is that Wikipedia records that edit, and there are moderators who come in and like, why the hell did this person change the page? The problem is that this is actually more about what we mean by saying axiom. And so I went to Wikipedia to point out that axiom is a statement that is taken to be true to serve as a premise or starting point for further reasoning and argument. That's literally the opening line of the Wikipedia. Well, all right, not literally. Literally, it would say, an axiom, postulate, or assumption is a statement that is taken to be true to serve as a premise or starting point for future reasoning and arguments. That's literally the first line in Wikipedia for axiom. And I brought this up during the debate because it was frustrating to me to have somebody say, it's just true. Axiom just means true. No, true means true. Axiom is something that we assume to be true for the sake of demonstrating it. And it's the demonstration that is important. If we assume that identity as a logical proposition is true, we can show that that's true, but we can't show it's universally true, which is what I went through a minute ago. But if you assume something in order to demonstrate things, and it turns out that the demonstration shows otherwise, then your assumption is wrong. In logic, there's an argument called a reductio ad absurdum. And that is a specific syllogism structure where you assume premise one, and then you add a second premise, and then you reach a conclusion that contradicts the premise. That's what you're doing. Let's assume that the moon is made of green cheese. And then we get there and we say, the moon's not made of green cheese. Clearly our assumption is false. Now that's a scientific exploration and not just a premise one, premise two conclusion. But a reductio ad absurdum is there so that we can evaluate whether or not this premise is true. Because if an argument is structured such that it has two premises that are true and the structure is valid, then the conclusion must be true. And so if you get to a conclusion that contradicts your opening premise, you know that the opening premise is simply not true. If the conclusion is true and it conflicts with your premise, it's not true. Reductio ad absurdum is what we're doing when we take something as an assumption. What is the demonstration for his assumption of the axiom that God exists? That's the key. If you assume God exists, what does that tell you about the world? I don't know. And since people can't necessarily agree on God and what God thinks and what impact God may or may not have on the world, I don't know how they can know either. If you're in a position where you're assuming something and you look around the world and there's nothing that is necessarily consistent with it, don't get me wrong, a God existing may be consistent with Matt has a box cutter. God exists, Matt has a box cutter, therefore God exists. Gets us to a circular argument affirming your thing. But there's nothing about me having a box cutter that conflicts with a God. So you need to know more about the characteristics of this God. What does this God want? How does it interact with reality? What does it tell us about reality? Because otherwise, you're arguing for a useless deistic proposition, which you can't do anything but assume. I mean, you can not assume it, but I mean, you can't demonstrate it because you're talking about a God that doesn't manifest in any detectable way with reality. And that's something that Ben and I could have a better conversation with. So, I would have loved to have seen any evidence for the existence of God so we could talk about whether or not it was good. But instead of getting evidence for the existence of God, what we got was an assertion about God. What we got was a claim that God is axiomatic and that means true. And then if my rebuttal is axiomatic doesn't mean true, it means we're assuming it's true because we can't demonstrate it's true, then necessarily the axiomatic argument for the existence of God, which he didn't structure as an argument, isn't an argument, but is in fact an assertion, which is demonstrably false. This notion that God is axiomatically true, if we assume that it's true, we assume the axioms are things that cannot be demonstrated in their totality. They may be partially demonstrated, like identity, non-contradiction, excluded middle, can be demonstrated, they just can't be demonstrated to be true everywhere, all the time, and inviolate. With a God, you can't even demonstrate that You can't, like, if you say, we're going to assume that God is true and we're going to take a look at the world and see if there's anything here that is inconsistent with God. Well, that's a problem. What you need to do is see, are these things in reality necessarily contingent with and required by the existence of a God? Or does the existence of God necessarily result in these things? And since the God that he's defining is essentially a nondescript, powerful agent that stops the first cause infinite regress, I don't know how you would demonstrate any of that. And the truth is, neither does Ben, or he would have. If somebody has a clear demonstration of God, they just present it. They don't have to sit here and go, well, it's axiomatically true. Okay, well, that's not a demonstration. Yes, it is. No, I'm sorry. A demonstration is producing the fact, producing evidence and argument that reliably confirms the proposition. It is the fact that becomes overwhelming. Merely claiming, or the collection of facts that becomes overwhelming, merely claiming that God is axiomatic isn't evidence. It's not good evidence. It's barely, I don't even know if it counts as bad evidence, if it doesn't really count as evidence at all. So that was that debate. Despite that, I like Ben. I enjoyed it. I might have another conversation with Ben if that's what people wanted, provided we could structure the topic and the discussion slightly differently. Because if I show up to debate, is there sufficient evidence to believe that a God exists? Or should we believe that Jesus fed thousands of people with loaves and fishes? That's something that might be of interest to have those kinds of discussions about, okay, here's a claim that seems supernatural. I have no, or is identified as supernatural. I have no evidence for it. What am I supposed to do? Those conversations could be good. And I do not think that this debate did Ben any favors. I don't think it did anything for me either. And it's not because I'm an atheist who thinks that Ben is wrong. I'm not sitting here going, I smoked another Christian boy. They showed up with the dumbest argument. That is not the way that I do things, and I don't want to. And yet, curiously, that is quite often what happens. Actually, I commented during this debate about the cesspool that is the chat participants in modern day debates. That's what they're doing. Literally, while I'm debating, it's, Matt's too stupid. Matt doesn't understand this. Look at Matt. He's getting angry. Look at this. Look at that. It is all mockery. And the thing is, I don't for a second believe that the people who are in there making those comments are representative of most Christians, because I have been a Christian and gone to church and have many family who are Christians, and they're not sitting around. When I had an hour and a half conversation with my uncle about the existence of God, I'm pretty sure he didn't hang up the phone and go into his wife and kids and go, man, I just completely bitch slapped Matt on the existence of God. That's just not the way most people think about this. And I think that the sort of internet WWE style, I'm going to debate you and pwn you, is probably bad for debates in general. But I want to thank Modern Day Debates and Ben Fischer for doing this. Maybe there's an opportunity to do something else in the future. But on this debate, is there good evidence for the existence of God? My opponent presented no evidence. Not good evidence, not bad evidence, just no evidence. Instead, it was just an assertion that God exists, and this is axiomatically self-evident and therefore true. And to me, it demonstrates a misunderstanding on a couple of different topics. But if I'm wrong, and you're convinced that something we take as an axiom is necessarily true and should be believed merely because you say we're going to take it as an axiom, then please demonstrate why it is more reasonable for you to axiomatically assume that a God exists instead of axiomatically assuming that a God does not exist. That's where your work begins. We'll see you next time. Bye-bye. This video is made possible by supporters of the Atheist Debates Patreon project. You can find more information and add your support at patreon.com/atheistdebates.